in the region. Oman's legislative body, the Shura Council, on Monday discussed amending its boycott law against Israel. According to Omani officials, the council convened to discuss expanding the scope of the law, which would prohibit any kind of contact with Israeli entities in its entirety. The amendment would be a major setback to Israeli hopes that Muscat would soon normalize diplomatic relations with Jerusalem, especially as public criticism against Israel is actually growing among some of its newly found friends in the region. I-24 News Middle East correspondent Ariel Osaran reports.
Rumors and speculation over Oman potentially warming ties with Israel just received a cold shoulder as the Sultanate's Shura Council, its equivalent to Parliament, discussed broadening the scope of its boycott law against Israel. The deputy chairman of the council said the amendment, proposed by several members of the council, seeks to, quote, expand the criminalization and boycott of this entity, prohibiting all contact with Israelis by any means, in person or even virtual. The session ended with the proposal referred to the council's legislative committee. And this surprising move comes amid Israeli efforts to secure Omani approval for Israeli commercial flights to fly over the country's airspace, as well as speculation that the Sultanate could potentially join the Abraham Accords with Israel, following the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Morocco. But it would appear that public support for diplomatic relations with Israel is waning also among some of Jerusalem's newly found partners. Bahrain, for example, hundreds of demonstrators have been protesting for weeks against the kingdom's relations with Israel, as well as against the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah. And in Morocco, hundreds of protesters took to the streets across the country on Saturday to demonstrate against their country's normalized relations with Israel. And so, 2 years after the signing of the historic Abraham Accords that saw a number of Arab states normalize ties with Israel, Jerusalem finds itself facing growing challenges in its hopes to further integrate in the region.
And still with me in studio is our senior diplomatic correspondent, Owen Altman. And joining us as well here in the studio is Dr. Emmanuel Navon, senior fellow at the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security and International Relations expert. Thank you both very much. Emmanuel, I want to start with you. Oman and Saudi Arabia are often looked at as the two most likely countries now to join the Accords. But with all the news that's coming out with airspace rights, it appears that the one can't be done without the other.
Right. It's. I think this decision by the parliament in Oman came as a surprise to many Israeli decision makers, because, as your report mentioned, Netanyahu himself, when he was prime minister, visited Oman, and there was a lot of talk about Oman and Saudi Arabia joining the Abraham Accords. And Netanyahu himself has been talking about his objective of hoping that eventually Saudi Arabia will join the Abraham Accords. This looks like, you know, it's not going that in the right direction, and I think it might be also has to do also about the upcoming coalition in Israel. It might be also a signal sent by those countries, at least by Oman, to the upcoming Israeli governments. But it definitely comes as a disappointment to Israel, especially as you know, the current U.S. administration and the previous one really tried to bring Oman and Saudi Arabia on board when it comes to normalization with Israel.
And Owen, I want to bring you into the conversation. The Abraham Accords were meant to launch this transformative new era in the region. Yet, as we saw with Israeli journalists in Qatar and what we're seeing with today with protests taking place by civilians in the Bahraini capital, it seems like the people-to-people relations haven't improved, if at all.
Yeah, I just don't agree with that. I just, you know, there's this narrative that's taken hold based on a small amount of polling, Batya, that public support is eroding. Look, hundreds of people protesting in Manama, hundreds of people protesting against normalization. Doesn't this mean that the Abraham Accords are in decline? I don't think so. You know, on our channel, Batya, about a month ago, we launched a poll put forth by Mitchell Barak's Kivun Institute and by the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, again, a German-affiliated one, about polling in the Gulf states, including towards Israel. The favorability for ratings for Israel in these countries ranges from about 20 to 30%, maybe 50% or so negative. The UAE, an outlier, by the way, with still at least plurality support, if not majority support for Israel in terms of favorability. But 20 to 30% favorability rating for Israel, you ask people in a poll in Arab countries, up or down vote on Israel, okay? 20 to 30% are giving an up vote to a pollster. That's an astounding result for Israel. That's something we would not have dreamed of 5 or 10 years ago. I don't know if it's the result of the Abraham Accords, the cause of the Abraham Accords. I don't even know if those numbers have gone down, but that is absolutely a great foundation for Israel to build people-to-people relations with that 20 to 30%. You see it progress every day. And yes, there are going to be some demonstrations, okay, whether it be in Manama, whether it be in Morocco. Maybe people are gathering more strength to do that now because of this or that that's happening in the region. But I don't buy this narrative that the Abraham Accords are in decline. The Oman story, I do think that is a real story, right? That's a decision being made by a government that's taking the country decidedly in a different direction, as Emmanuel said, in a way that Israelis might not have expected, for a country that, because of its geography, is particularly important to Israel because of the issue of flights to the east, and politically is important to Israel because it's kind of seen as a swing vote and as a conduit to other countries in its own way. But this idea that the Abraham Accords are eroding in public opinion in the Arab world and in the Gulf, I just don't buy it.
Emmanuel, do you tend to agree, whether it's narrative or rhetoric? We often hear the same saying being told, that it seems like it's the opposite to Tehran, where it's not the regime that's against us, but rather the people. Do you tend to agree with what Owen said?
Yeah, and I think, as Owen mentioned, there was like a few people in Manama, you know, like this is not representative of public opinion. And actually you do see, unlike, by the way, the peace agreements that we have with Egypt and Jordan, in the case of Egypt and Jordan, it's really government-to-government relations based on mutual interest, but you don't really have any interaction between civil societies. In the case of the UAE, of Morocco, and of Bahrain, you do have actually a lot of, you know, people-to-people relations. You have mutual investments, you have a lot of tourism, you have academic cooperation, a lot of partnerships in energy and food security happening all the time. So you do have actually a lot of normalization on the ground going between Israel, Morocco, the UAE, and Bahrain. Of course, not everybody supports it, but it's not a few hundred people demonstrating in Morocco or Bahrain that are going to undermine this actual peace taking place on the ground.
I do want to just say one thing. I do think that those 100 people, Emmanuel, I'm sure you would agree, do represent a big part of the public opinion. I mean, listen, in absolute terms, Israel's numbers are absolutely underwater in almost all of these countries, meaning the unfavorability ratings are much higher, even 2 times as high as the favorability ratings. All I'm saying is we should have reasonable expectations about what Israel's favorability ratings are going to be in Arab countries, and a 20 to 30% favorability rating for Israel in Arab countries. Again, you're asking people in these countries, Batya, Emmanuel, up or down vote in Israel, thumbs up or thumbs down, 20 to 30% giving a thumbs up after 100 years of ethnic conflict, after all that's been done in the media in those countries and the societies. That's a terrific result for Israel. The glass is 1/5 empty, not 4. It was 1/5 full, not 4/5 empty.
And I want to continue to ask you, yesterday we were discussing in studio about what I called the creme de la creme of the Abraham Accords, which would be this big fish of getting relations and normalizations between Israel and Saudi Arabia. There's just so much to it, but I suppose would these people-to-people relations, even being 20 to 30%, have to have an impact on that, considering the fact that one of the main sticking points is the fact that of this West Bank annexation? Do you think that Netanyahu will actually follow through on that? How does all of this play out? Will he end up risking the demands that they are asking for in comparisons to his own?
Well, I think when it comes to Mohammed bin Salman, of course, you know, public opinion is not an element in his decision-making. About a month ago already, he indicated, not completely directly, but that he was willing to consider normalization with Israel if the U.S. was to really upgrade its military relation with Saudi Arabia and give it guarantees in light of the fact that Iran is already a threshold country and that a nuclear deal with Iran is no longer on the table. So he's open to the idea, and obviously one of the conditions would be that for Israel to freeze any plan of annexing, even partial annexation in the West Bank. That goes without saying. It's interesting that when he aired the possibility of normalization with Israel about a month ago, he did not specifically and openly mention the Palestinian issue. Like, he didn't demand a Palestinian state as the previous, you know, like 20 years ago Saudi Arabia did. But obviously one of the conditions, which was also a condition set by the UAE, would be that Israel would not proceed with any type of annexation in the West Bank.
Right. Emmanuel Navon, Owen Altman, thank you both very much for breaking that all down on what is bound to be a very interesting conversation, hopefully in the near future.